There are islands in this world that carry stories far larger than their size would suggest. Tonight, I'd like to take you to one of them, a place where empires clashed, where cultures were born from profound struggle, and where the very meaning of freedom was redefined. This is Jamaica. And its history is, in many ways, the history of the modern world itself. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, Jamaica was known by another name entirely. The Taíno people, who had inhabited the island for nearly 1,000 years, called it Jamaica, meaning land of wood and water. It's a fitting name. Even today, Jamaica's interior remains dense with forest, cut through by countless rivers flowing down from the Blue Mountains. The Taíno were not a primitive people, as early European accounts often suggested. They were accomplished navigators, farmers, and artisans. They cultivated cassava, built sophisticated fishing weirs, and created ceremonial bull courts that suggest a complex social and religious life. Their society was organized into chiefdoms, each led by a cacique, or chief, and they maintained trade networks that stretched across the Caribbean. According to archaeological records, the Taíno population of Jamaica at the time of European contact numbered somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 souls. They had created a sustainable way of life on the island, one that had endured for centuries. But this raises an important question: what happens when two worlds, entirely unknown to each other, suddenly collide? On May 4, 1494, Christopher Columbus made his second voyage to the Americas and became the first European to sight Jamaica. He would return 10 years later, in 1503, when his ships became stranded at St. Anne's Bay. The Spanish formally claimed Jamaica in 1509, establishing the settlement of Nueva Sevilla and New Seville on the north coast. What followed was a tragedy that historians have documented with painful clarity. Within a single generation, the Taíno population was decimated. Disease, forced labor, and violence reduced their numbers catastrophically. By the mid-16th century, the Taíno as a distinct people had effectively vanished from Jamaica, though their genetic and cultural legacy would persist in subtle ways. The Spanish found Jamaica less profitable than their other Caribbean holdings. There was no gold to speak of, and the island became primarily a supply base, a place to raise livestock and grow provisions for ships traveling to more lucrative colonies. Spanish Jamaica remained sparsely populated and relatively neglected for nearly 150 years. But across the Atlantic, another European power was watching with considerable interest. In 1655, as part of Oliver Cromwell's Western design, an ambitious plan to break Spanish dominance in the Caribbean, an English fleet of 38 ships carrying approximately 8,000 men arrived at Jamaica. The Spanish garrison, numbering fewer than 200 soldiers, offered minimal resistance before fleeing into the interior and eventually evacuating to Cuba. What the English discovered, however, was that conquering Jamaica and controlling it were entirely different matters. The Spanish had freed their enslaved Africans before departing, and these men and women fled into the mountainous interior, joining earlier communities of people who had escaped slavery. These groups, who would become known as the Maroons, established autonomous settlements in the most inaccessible regions of the island. They would prove to be formidable opponents to British authority for the next century and a half. The early decades of English Jamaica were chaotic. The island became a haven for privateers, essentially state-sanctioned pirates, who operated out of Port Royal, which quickly became one of the wealthiest and most notorious cities in the Americas. Historians estimate that by the 1660s, Port Royal had a population of nearly 7,000 people, extraordinary for the time, and a reputation for vice that scandalized European society. Then, on June 7, 1692, a massive earthquake struck Jamaica. Port Royal, built largely on sand and loose sediment, literally sank into the harbor. Contemporary accounts describe buildings sliding into the sea, streets opening up, and approximately 2,000 people perishing in minutes. Many saw it as divine judgment. It's worth pausing here, because what happened next would shape not only Jamaica's future, but the economic foundation of the British Empire itself. Following the destruction of Port Royal, British Jamaica's economy underwent a fundamental transformation. The island became a sugar colony, and by the mid-18th century, it was the most valuable colonial possession in the British Empire, more profitable even than the 13 North American colonies. This wealth came at an unspeakable human cost. Between 1700 and 1808, when Britain abolished the slave trade, approximately 750,000 African men, women, and children were forcibly transported to Jamaica. The conditions they faced were among the most brutal in the history of slavery. Jamaica's death rate among enslaved people was so high that the population could only be maintained through constant new arrivals from Africa. The sugar plantations were factories of cruelty. Contemporary accounts from both overseers and enslaved people themselves describe working conditions that were deliberately calculated to extract maximum labor before death. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person arriving in Jamaica was less than 7 years. Yet resistance was constant and widespread. Small acts of defiance, work slowdowns, tool breaking, poisoning of masters occurred daily on every plantation. But there were also larger, organized rebellions that terrified the planter class. The Maroons remained unconquered in their mountain strongholds. 2 major wars erupted between the British and various Maroon communities, the First Maroon War from 1728 to 1740, and the second from 1795 to 1796. The First Maroon War concluded with treaties that granted the Maroons autonomy, land rights, and freedom in exchange for ceasing to harbor newly escaped enslaved people and assisting in suppressing slave rebellions. These treaties, still preserved in archives, represent one of the few instances where escaped enslaved people successfully negotiated recognition of their freedom from a colonial power. This detail changes how we see everything that follows, because the Maroons proved that resistance could succeed, that freedom could be won and defended. This knowledge spread throughout enslaved communities across the island. The early 19th century saw increasing resistance to slavery throughout Jamaica. In 1831, a massive uprising known as the Baptist War, or Christmas Rebellion, erupted in western Jamaica. Led by Samuel Sharp, an enslaved Baptist deacon, approximately 60,000 enslaved people refused to work and demanded freedom. The rebellion was brutally suppressed. Samuel Sharp was executed, but before his death, he reportedly said, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." The rebellion had consequences far beyond Jamaica. The violence required to suppress it, the destruction of property, and the moral questions it raised accelerated the British abolition movement. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which took effect on August 1, 1834. However, full emancipation did not arrive immediately. The British instituted an apprenticeship system that bound former enslaved people to their former masters for 6 more years. This system was so transparently exploitative that it was abandoned in 1838, when complete emancipation finally came to Jamaica. But freedom, the formerly enslaved would quickly discover, came without resources, without land, and into an economy still controlled entirely by the planter class. The decades following emancipation were marked by profound economic hardship for Jamaica's black majority. Former enslaved people attempted to establish independent farms, but access to land was severely restricted. The colonial government, dominated by white planters, passed legislation designed to force freed people back onto plantations as low-wage laborers. By the 1860s, Jamaica faced a crisis. A drought devastated small farms, while the colonial government seemed indifferent to the suffering of the black population. On October 11, 1865, frustration erupted into open rebellion at Morant Bay. Led by Paul Bogle, a Baptist deacon, and supported by George William Gordon, a mixed-race member of the Colonial Assembly, hundreds of people marched on the courthouse demanding justice. The confrontation turned violent. The courthouse was burned, and several officials were killed. The colonial response was savage. Governor Edward Eyre declared martial law and unleashed a campaign of retribution that killed approximately 439 people, flogged hundreds more, and destroyed over 1,000 homes. Paul Bogle and George William Gordon were both executed. The brutality shocked even Victorian Britain, leading to Eyre's recall and eventually to Jamaica becoming a direct crown colony, governed from London rather than by local planters. These events raise an important question: how does a society move forward when the structures of oppression remain largely intact, even after formal freedom has been granted? The early 20th century brought new forms of resistance and organization to Jamaica. The island's economy remained dominated by sugar and banana production, with working conditions that differed little from the plantation era. In 1938, widespread labor unrest swept across Jamaica. Led by figures like Alexander Bustamante and Norman Manley, workers demanded better wages, working conditions, and political representation. These labor uprisings marked a turning point in Jamaican history. From this movement emerged Jamaica's 2 major political parties: the Jamaica Labour Party, founded by Bustamante, and the People's National Party, founded by Norman Manley. Both men would become national heroes, though their political philosophies differed considerably. The Second World War accelerated political change throughout the British Empire. The contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while denying it at home became increasingly untenable. In 1944, Jamaica received universal adult suffrage, and gradually, more powers were transferred from the British Colonial Office to elected Jamaican officials. In 1958, Jamaica joined the West Indies Federation, a short-lived attempt to unite British Caribbean colonies into a single independent nation. However, disputes over the structure of the federation led to its collapse after just 4 years. On August 6, 1962, Jamaica became an independent nation within the British Commonwealth. After more than 450 years of colonial rule, Spanish and British, Jamaica was finally free to determine its own course. Independence brought both hope and enormous challenges. Jamaica inherited an economy still heavily dependent on agriculture and bauxite mining, with deep inequalities and limited industrial development. The first decades of independence saw competing visions for Jamaica's future. Michael Manley, son of Norman Manley, became Prime Minister in 1972 and pursued democratic socialism, attempting to reduce inequality and assert greater control over Jamaica's resources. His tenure was marked by significant social progress but also economic difficulties and political violence. The 1980 election between Manley's PNP and Edward Seager's JLP was one of the most violent in Jamaican history, with over 800 people killed in political violence. Seager's victory brought a shift toward free market policies and closer alignment with the United States. Yet during these turbulent decades, Jamaica's cultural influence was growing exponentially worldwide. Reggae music, which emerged from Kingston's recording studios in the late 1960s, became a global phenomenon. Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, Bunny Wailer, and countless other Jamaican artists carried messages of resistance, spirituality, and social justice to every corner of the earth. Jamaican athletes dominated track and field, with Usain Bolt becoming the fastest human ever timed. Jamaican cuisine, language, and artistic expression influenced global culture far beyond what the island's small size would suggest possible. This cultural power raises a profound question: how does a small island nation of fewer than 3 million people exert such disproportionate influence on global culture? Modern Jamaica faces many challenges familiar to post-colonial societies. Crime, particularly in Kingston's inner-city communities, remains a serious problem. Economic growth has been inconsistent, and many Jamaicans have emigrated in search of opportunities, creating a large diaspora in North America, the United Kingdom, and elsewhere. Yet Jamaica continues to punch far above its weight internationally. The island maintains a robust democracy with regular peaceful transfers of power. Jamaican artists, musicians, and athletes continue to achieve global recognition. The nation has produced thought leaders, scientists, and innovators who have made significant contributions in their fields. Jamaica's history of resistance, from the Maroons to Samuel Sharp to Paul Bogle to the labor movements, has created a culture that values independence, creative expression, and standing up to injustice. These values, forged through centuries of struggle, continue to define Jamaican identity. Perhaps the lesson here isn't simply about one island's history. It's about how people, even under the most oppressive circumstances, find ways to resist, to create, to maintain their humanity, and ultimately, to shape their own destiny. Jamaica's history is not an easy one. It contains some of humanity's greatest cruelties and some of its most inspiring examples of resistance and resilience. From the Taíno civilization through Spanish colonization, from the horrors of plantation slavery through the long struggle for freedom and self-determination, Jamaica's story is complex, painful, and ultimately, profoundly human. The island that the Taíno called Jamaica, land of wood and water, has given the world far more than sugar and bauxite. It has given us music that speaks to the soul, athletes who redefine human possibility, and an example of how culture and spirit can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy them. I'd be interested to know how this history connects with your own family stories or understanding of the Caribbean. Many of you have shared deeply personal reflections on previous videos, and those contributions enrich everyone's understanding. Please feel free to share your thoughts below. If you found this exploration worthwhile, if you appreciate histories told with care and respect for complexity, I invite you to subscribe. I also share additional references, maps, and related materials in the community tab for those who enjoy continuing their own research. Thank you for taking this journey through Jamaica's entire history. Until we meet again, I wish you well.